Hello, Paddy.
Laura, hello.
Hello, how are you?
Very well. I've been interviewing Bjorn from ABBA.
Oh, that's fun. What did Bjorn from ABBA have to say?
He wanted to pay tribute to his sound engineer who was on all the early work, who's unfortunately died at the age of 80.
Oh, that's sad news.
Well, he said it was sad, but then he said he was full of joy. He made the job of making ABBA joy, and one of the reasons that they decided to split was when the joy went.
Did he say thank you for the music?
He did say thank you for the music.
But a different topic today. We're talking about a massive, massive, giant subject, the subject of defence, not just because it's incredibly important. Foreign relations have been so much of the political conversation for a long time, haven't they? But also on Monday, the government's publishing its long-awaited, as these things always are, defence review.
Yes, so in this edition, we're going to speak to a man who was Britain's top spy.
And he is very well qualified to tell us about the state of the world, the state of the threats we face, and therefore what the government actually ought to do about it. What should they be spending money on? What should they not be spending money on? And from where might the greatest risks emerge?
All ahead in Saturday's Newscast.
So who better to help us know when I say than Sir Alex Younger, the former head of MI6, the UK's foreign intelligence agency. So Alex, thanks so much indeed for joining us on a weekend newscast.
My pleasure.
So we are in this world of evolving threats. The government's been telling us for a long time that the world is getting more dangerous, and we're going to therefore receive the defence review in that context with some extra money attached. But in your view, what is the biggest threat, which perhaps is an unfair question, but could you give us your view on what the biggest threat is?
Well, look, I think, first of all, you need to be a bit careful about fixating on particular threats because these are long-term issues and stuff can change really quickly. So I think, correctly enough, the instinct in my world is always to try to think about building up capabilities because that's the thing you can't create overnight. But Laura, you get straight to a tension that undoubtedly will have been the backdrop to this review because you've got a sort of chronic and acute tension. Obviously, China is the rising power. It does not share our ideology, and in some ways it's implacably hostile, but it's not necessarily on a path to military confrontation with us. In Russia, that just isn't the case. Putin is now defined in opposition to the West. He's got form, he's invaded a European country. And we'd be fools if we didn't understand that he represents a clear and present danger and that it's very unlikely to stop here. The thing that unifies these two things in my mind, so they do generate really hard choices, like about aircraft carriers and ships and stuff. But in some ways, there's something that joins them up, which is in the end, this is going to be about a Chinese technological world, whether you're Russia or China. So there's one really clear so what for us, which is that our forces need now to be capable of operating and prevailing in a world which is basically wired by China. They are the pacing technological threat. And I will leave it to the sort of soothsayers to say whether they become an actual military threat. But certainly their military capabilities are growing apace. And meanwhile, Russia, I just think, what else do we need to know?
It's almost easier to understand it backwards because in 2014 they invaded Crimea and we just sat around. I mean, there was a few sanctions hither and thither, but the conversation that we're having now, fully 11 years later, Sir Alex, were you having it then? Were you saying to people, guys, hello?
Yeah, well, I think two things. One, of course, if you're a spy, you've got a massive advantage, and it isn't about knowing secrets, because frankly, knowing what Putin's going to do next, well, I don't think Putin often knows that. What you see as a spy is how states actually behave, not how they say they're behaving. And then it was palpably obvious from 2008 onwards that all this stuff about the end of history and the triumph of democracy was just sort of self-serving. It was also really obvious that in the end, the US didn't have the power to police the globalization that it created. So in many levels, this looked pretty inevitable. We were living on borrowed time, and we had run our defenses down too far. But Paddy, the way you phrase the question is also really important. This isn't isn't so much about preparing for war as preventing war. And the big lesson from Putin 2014, 2017, 2008, whenever it is, he's crossed the line. He's crossed the line because we've blinked and there've been no consequence, and he's done it again. So the key point here is we have to develop the capabilities to attach consequences to these early moves. That's how we prevent a war. And I emphasize this because I don't want to come over as some kind of raging securocrat who gets off on the idea of some future conflict. Absolutely not. This is how we keep ourselves safe. We invest now so that we won't have to do it in an emergency setting down the track.
And I really want to hear in a couple of minutes about what you think that ought to look like then.
Yeah.
But I just want to pick up on something that really struck me about what you just said. You said all this guff in 2008 about the end of history. We were living on borrowed time.
Yeah.
That's so striking to hear that from you, because our politicians were in that era doing things like inviting Vladimir Putin for press conferences. George Bush saying, I've looked him in the eye. I can trust this guy. Tony Blair got Putin over for a press conference and from memory was proud to be the first Western leader to host him. We had George Osborne and David Cameron then years later cozying up to the Chinese, a golden era they wanted to have. I remember being at press conferences with President Xi here, getting a state visit. And yet you and the intelligence services thought at that time this was all going to come to a horrible end. Were they not listening to you? Or were you not shouting loudly enough?
Look, first of all, I don't want to sound like clever with hindsight. Of course, everyone drank the Kool-Aid, and Russia was at an extraordinary. I mean, when I joined the service, it was on his knees. So to be fair, it would have been a feat of imagination to understand how bad things would have become by now. But look, it's human. I think my wife identifies in me as a sort of classic middle-aged man, the trait of wishful thinking. And that is what we did. So we created this narrative which said that, particularly in Europe, that the rules have moved on. We were in some post-ideological phase, that it was only a question of how quickly everyone else caught up with democracy. And maybe we believed that, but it was really pretty useful.
Yeah.
In any case, it was a comforting bromide. The privilege we had in the spy world, obviously we didn't have intelligence to say that Putin was going to invade in 2022. The privilege we had in the intelligence world, of course, is we see states not as they want to be seen, but how they behave when no one's looking. And at that point, it was really clear, neither Xi Jinping nor Vladimir Putin in particular had got the memo about the end of history. Yeah. And it was also pretty clear that the US, over time, the US security guarantee was the thing that was keeping us safe. It wasn't some fundamental philosophical change in the world. And that's time limited too.
And in Europe, we took that all for granted. We were smug. The Germans hardly paid anything for their defence. They had to be dragged to get the checkbook out. Can you do more on our mindset, Sir Alex? It seems that, how is a British mind in 2025 different from the British mind in 1966? What's happened to us? What kind of... You said that we look upon our army like we watch... Like English fans might watch the English football team on the telly.
Well, I don't want to, go for the UK in particular. I think this is a broader issue. And in some ways, we have a much more realistic view. But to your point, I think we're culpable of a couple of fallacies. And the first is that there's been some sea change in world affairs, which has somehow intrinsically reduce the existence of existential threats and ideological competition. And that's, I just think, because we've all been brought up during a time apparently completely free of those threats. And that's completely ahistorical. For us, it feels normal, but it's extremely unusual. So people in 1966 will have lived memory of exactly the reverse. And then there's this kind of incipient idea, as you say, of professionalization, the idea that somehow you can turn defense into a technical problem rather than a whole of society issue. And of course, we're all incredibly proud about what that produces in terms of highly capable professional armed forces. But these high intensity wars, this isn't wars of choice, expeditionary wars. If one came at us, it would be a whole of society effort. And by the way, we're sort of there in some sense already because we're already in the grey zone, which is explicitly an attempt to undermine our societies and our capabilities below the threshold of war. So I think there's already quite a steep educational hill to climb.
In terms then of what the government ought to do about this, how would you assess our capabilities now, both, in terms of the state of the armed forces and the intelligence services? And if you were holding the pen on the review, or if you had been holding the pen on the review, or you were advising John Healey, where would you tell him to put the money?
I admit I've been on a bit of a journey on this because by dint of my background, tend to take a global approach to these issues. And I think the one lesson I learned as the chief of SIS, MI6, is if you haven't got the tech on your side, you're not going to win. So that orients me to the sort of long-term chronic issue that we face, that we're gradually ceding our technological advantage to potential opponents. And in the end, alongside our values, it's our tech edge that's kept us safe all these years. So that took me to what I would call the broader version. But clearly, the thing about politicians is they have to make choices. And the opposing argument is, for God's sake, you've got a rising threat on our eastern border. It's in Europe. Just organize essentially within NATO to deter Russia. And I do see the logic of that. By the way, I don't know what's going to come out on Monday, but my suspicion is it will tilt towards the sort of NATO argument. I think that in other respects, what he was doing today was good. Talking about some of the really prosaic stuff here. I mean, if the housing's rubbish and the pay's rubbish, you're not going to recruit soldiers and sailors. I get that. But I'll be watching very carefully on Monday to see the other half of this, which is how we're actually essentially going to innovate our way through this. And I don't know the detail of that yet.
So you come on our podcast because you want people to hear from your experience. At what time do you judge this to be? Because we know we could call you up and you could say yes or no for years, but what time is this? What kind of a time in our life is this?
I think I'm honestly rather conflicted when I answer that question, because I actually think we can sort this out. And I think a big enemy for us is a sense of helplessness and lack of agency. But on the other hand, we're leaving it very, very late. My guess, again, I'm not privileged to current intelligence, but the Russian army has performed reasonably in Ukraine, even if it is now sadly reconstituting and refocusing. It will take them a while to sort themselves out, probably a few years. And my other point, which I think I've already made, is that deterring Russia is not about like being America. It's about demonstrating the conviction and the capability at the margin to attach consequences to what Putin does, which is a lower bar, but one we manifestly don't meet at the moment. Manifestly don't. Putin is convinced that we will blink at every turn.
What about the threat from cyber attacks? I mean, as you were saying, we are sort of in the grey zone, and cyber is something that, this country is still trying to repel, as we understand it, having to repel, shall we say, Russian efforts to get into our systems, to get into our infrastructure, to get into our country in all sorts of sort of invidious ways. But what should the government's response be to combat the cyber threats?
Well, I think first of all, you asked me about what good would be in this review. It's recognizing that the technology dimension massively widens the attack surface, offers actually a whole set of opportunities for us to get ahead of this, but we just can't pretend this stuff isn't going on. So there's something about internalizing it. I think cyber is interesting. Actually, in some ways in Ukraine, it's been the dog that hasn't barked. If the Russians want to kill the electricity system in Ukraine, they tend to drop a bomb on a substation. So it's quite subtle, the way this is operating. But I think the way I see the conflict with Russia developing is more, at least initially, in the grey space, but they really will use cyber to try to undermine our infrastructure. And here, it's a double story in the UK. We've got amazing capabilities. We've got our national cyber force. We've got our National Cybersecurity Centre. But my rough estimation would be that while, we can array formidable cyber capabilities, as a nation, as a digital nation, we're wide open. So there's a huge job to do. And that isn't really something the government can do. That's a whole of society thing. So this issue of cyber resilience, along with infrastructure resilience, energy resilience, network resilience, we've got to have a completely different conversation about this. And of course, that's a bit about money. But I think, when we all look at our own personal behavior, we'd concede a lot of it is about education and priorities and what we choose to do and how we behave.
And we recently made an appeal to our 18-year-old newscasters to get in touch on the question of Europe. And if I think of the 18-year-old listener who's actually very adept, say, at programming or great with computers in a way that we could say that older people sometimes aren't, great with gaming.
You're looking directly at me as
I'm
you say that,
I'm looking in your
Paddy.
direction. I'm looking in your direction. Do we say,
right.
Do we say to 18-year-old newscasters, enlist? Should they be calling? Should they become spies?
Yeah, basically, absolutely. The premium for me is on innovation, and just to strike a more pessimistic note, I don't have a lot of confidence in government writ large, but particularly in the sort of defence community's capacity to innovate at the speed of the potential adversary. In fact, there's lots of really nice, cool stuff, accelerators and incubators and catalysts, and people are talking great on this. But actually, it's just a complete culture change. It still is going to take the average Western government a year to do something that Ukraine's doing in a week. So at this point, and of course there's risk involved, but risk is the issue. You want to get a broad spectrum of people involved. And that generation, they have something completely different to bring to the party.
So M's efforts are no longer enough. You need a different kind of operation in terms of getting things done. It's interesting you mentioned, though, Ukraine there, and I think there will be stuff in the review about taking some of the learnings from Ukraine, where literally they've been sort of refitting, sometimes in a slightly sort of Heath Robinson way, drones that you could almost order off Amazon, turn them into lethal machines. And obviously I'm kind of exaggerating to make the point, but that's something people in defence circles have told us about, that see how Ukraine has moved so fast. Well, see how the UK has helped Ukraine move very quickly in the development of new drones, and that's something they want to apply here. Whether they make it happen,
I don't think you're exaggerating at all, because we had the boss of Brompton's, the bike company, on, and he said there was a slowdown in the governing brains of their electric bicycle, because that could be used in drones. That same technology that is on a bicycle could be used in drone governance. So I don't think you're exaggerating at all. I think you're doing what Alex wants us to do, which is kind of get into a new mindset, unlock creative industries in Britain, and talk to 18-year-olds, get the geniuses in the universities. But you're saying do it yesterday.
Yeah, and by the way, I am really worried that, notwithstanding all of that, which I agree with, still it will take a year to get a new type of drone to the average infantryman in the field, and another year to get the software updated. And until that becomes a week, we're really vulnerable.
It's interesting, the Permanent Secretary, who's the top civil servant at the Ministry of Defence, has already said in evidence to MPs, yes, the specific orders and procurement and things after the Defence Review will come in the summer or even in the autumn. And that's not to make a criticism of him, David Williams, Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Defence, but it's to just put on the record something that so often happens in Whitehall, because our government is not used to operating very quickly, that it may be some months before what comes out in black and white on Monday is even translated into real orders and actually things happening. And a former defence minister said to me yesterday, actually said, there might be lots of great sounding things in this review, but there may not be many things that say get moving. And with the imperatives that we've heard about from you, Sir Alex, that may be one of the kind of gaps, I think, that the government has to try to answer. I also wonder if there might be a bit of a gap in the rhetoric, because you and I have talked about this before, Paddy, but Sir Alex, we often hear ministers saying this is a uniquely new dangerous moment. It's the most dangerous moment for decades. but we're going to have a review that's going to go on for many, many months, and then we're going to speed up funding a little bit, but then we're going to spend 3% by a decade, when you see other allies moving much, much quicker now.
Yeah.
Could we compare it? You mentioned being middle-aged. Could we compare it to the person who lets themselves go? They get they get complacent, and yet when they were young, going back to our younger listeners, they could take more on more quickly. And there's a sort of did the peace dividend make us?
I think it's experience, because that middle-aged person who lets himself go to sea then gets mugged, and their whole personal lifestyle changes. So the tragedy here is, we have the latent capability. We are, I think, an extraordinarily resilient country if we understand what's at stake. And so you get quite quickly to issues of political leadership here. Putin's done his bit, as has Donald Trump, by the way, in reminding us that we own this. It's kind of on us now. And in some ways, I'm quite beguiled by the challenge, because I think this could be quite a significant galvanizing force, particularly across the technology sector, that is in any case timely. But it does, to your point, Paddy, it feels a bit phony war at the moment, and that's not reassuring.
How far would you go towards conscription?
I think that so I wouldn't venture into that. I'm not an expert, but it's first of all, the reserves are in a parlous state, and they need to be sorted out, because the army is tiny. In an event of tension, it would need to expand quickly. Military people will tell you the best way to do that. But surely the first phase is what I've already said, is that people must feel a stake in this. And I've just been in Finland. Every single sort of businessman I spoke to was an officer in the Finnish army. It's a completely different mindset. And I think would be a really tough nut for Russia to crack. We're not going to become Finland, but I think that there's a leadership issue about galvanizing what we have already in us. We've got it, but we've got to show it.
And from the leadership you've seen so far from this government and this area, how would you rate it?
I think it's been pretty good, actually, because you could be cynical and say that Keir Starmer's effectively identified quite a useful kind of external factor that can drive a set of things that need to happen.
It's given him a script.
But basically, I think he has had a pretty good foreign policy time of it, actually, and I think that's given him a sense of direction and, frankly, confidence as well. So I think it's working, and what I really like, of course, is that without being overly transactional, this is also being used to change the relationship with Europe, which is really overdue. So I think we are moving in the right direction. But meanwhile, you've got some extraordinary things happening. Germany, look what's just happened there.
They've changed their constitution to spend lots more. Yeah, and that's
that's an example.
You're probably going to tell me that Donald Trump was right to.
So look, with most populists, they're very often right about the problem and completely wrong about the solution. So I think it's completely right. We were free riding, and he's done us an enormous favour in giving us a kick and making us own our own security. And that was coming anyway. America can't afford to police the world anymore. It just can't. Where he's totally wrong, is his perception of an alliance as a zero-sum transaction, and indeed a sort of tax on America. What has made America great and what's embodied its international force and capability and economy is the quality of its alliances. And I'll tell you this, at the end, I'm not an expert on America, I am an expert on China and Russia. What frightens Xi Jinping the most is not our aircraft carriers, it's the quality of our teamwork and alliances. That's what they really hate. All these complaints about encirclement and blockism and hegemony. It's really a complaint about our incredible capacity as democracies to work together. And it is worrying for me that Donald Trump's lost faith in that.
So interesting to hear you talk with all your experience and insight. I wonder if you will indulge us for a couple of moments in something slightly more frivolous after all our very important but serious conversations. I just wonder, if you were still a spy, what would be the one place that you'd like to go and work and find out what's really happening on the ground? Is there somewhere that should be on our radars that isn't, where a younger Sir Alex Younger,
Yeah.
before being a Knight of the Realm, would go and get your hands dirty.
Yeah, I was thinking about that actually. I would go to the Western Pacific. Because because of the, I mean, I did a lot of counterterrorism, for instance. I didn't spend a huge amount of time in the South Koreas or the Japans or the Taiwans or that region. And now, you'll have heard me, Laura. My focus on the long-term issues, the salience of technology, the consequences of fragmentation of globalization, the way in which wealth disperses in the world. I think that would be where I would be learning my languages now.
We shall say our goodbyes. It's been great to have you, and thank you for helping us be, well, you've been very learned, and I think Paddy and I, and hopefully everybody listening, have learned a lot from listening to you this afternoon. It's been a great pleasure having you.
No, it's been great talking to you. Thank you.
That's all for now. Goodbye.
Goodbye.